Good morning and welcome, or wherever you are. I guess it's not morning in all parts of the world. I'm Kirsten Spalding. I'm your MC for today's live stream 2020 Investor Summit on Climate Risk event. I'm the Senior Department Director for the Investor Network at Ceres, a sustainability nonprofit working with influential investors and companies on a host of global sustainability challenges, including climate risk, water risk, deforestation, and equitable workplaces. I'd like to start today by saying that our hearts go out to all those seriously affected by the global pandemic, and we're especially grateful to those on the front lines, risking so much and working hard to ensure that we all stay as healthy and safe as possible. I also want to thank each of you for participating. We realize that your personal and professional lives have been profoundly disrupted, but your unflappable commitment and courage shown by your participation today is truly inspiring. The generous commitment and support of our speakers, sponsors, and summit co-hosts, the UN Foundation and the UN Office for Partnerships, who've stood by us in this digital journey to reimagine the 2020 Investor Summit on Climate Risk, is so appreciated and must also be highlighted. We were able to transform our intended in-person summit into a digital program. We would not be here today without your essential support. Before we begin today's session, I have a few housekeeping notes. Note that the session is being recorded. We'll be providing all participants with a link to the recording shortly after the presentation. If you have any questions, you can enter them in the chat box that's located on your control panel. We'll do our best to answer those questions at the end of the session. And please note that there is always the potential on my end or on yours for a global bandwidth issue. If we have that experience, we'll wait just a few seconds for the bandwidth to readjust and then we'll resume. So thank you ahead of time for your patience in the event that such an issue arises. Now it's my pleasure to introduce our speakers. Today we're joined by two truly inspirational speakers. Richard Trumka, President of the AFL-CIO, who is the highest ranking labor leader in the United States, and Torben Møger Pedersen, CEO of Pension Denmark. Mr. Trumka has represented US workers as a leader in the AFL-CIO since 1995. Before his election, he was first as Secretary Treasurer and then as President in 2009. He was President of the United Mine Workers of America for more than a decade. His personal history makes President Trumka an unlikely environmental advocate, and it may surprise some to hear his passionate commitment to addressing climate change. President Trumka has been an unwavering champion for a low-carbon economic future that builds sustainable communities and provides workers good jobs in infrastructure and industries that will provide energy, goods, and services as the world moves to achieve the goals of the Paris Agreement and aligns with the 1.5-degree global warming target. Today, as capital markets are reeling from the volatility of the COVID-19 consequences, we are looking forward to hearing President Trumka's vision for economic recovery and the role that global investors can play in supporting sustainable recovery plans with their own dollars, their advocacy with global policymakers, and their influence with the companies that they own in their portfolios. Mr. Torben Møger Pedersen will respond to President Trumka's remarks with insights from his experience as CEO of Pension Denmark since the pension fund was established in 1992. Mr. Pedersen shares President Trumka's history as a labor leader. Prior to his position at Pension Denmark, he was CEO at PKS Pension Fund and held the position as head of secretariat at Denmark's General Workers Union. Under Mr. Pedersen's leadership, Pension Denmark has made extraordinary investments in climate solutions, always with a commitment to ensuring that the pension investments support and create high-road jobs for workers and guarantee worker voice. These investments span both developed and developing markets, and today I anticipate that we will hear about some of Pension Denmark's recent investment experiences and opportunities in renewable energy projects here in the United States. President Trumka, it's my great pleasure to welcome you to today's webinar. You join us at an extraordinarily difficult moment in history. Here in the US, we're suffering profound double-digit unemployment in the wake of the COVID-19 pandemic. Many of the workers you represent have lost jobs or have had their hours and pay dramatically reduced. Many communities remain quarantined, and those essential service workers who have returned or never stopped working are risking their health and the health of their communities by working. For those workers who do not have union representation, the personal consequences may be even higher than for your members. They may not have health care or pensions. They may not have job protections and may not even have a voice in how their companies weather the pandemic and begin the recovery process. As you look forward to the next months and years, we'd like to hear your vision. What do you think about economic recovery? You announced with former Economic Secretary Ernest Moniz a partnership to create climate strategies that achieve zero carbon goals while preserving jobs. How does this partnership fit into the recovery plans, and what are the most urgent steps to restart the economy, help the families who are suffering today, and focus on rebuilding communities that were already disadvantaged before the pandemic and are really devastated now? As you lay out your vision, do you think that climate change and other environmental issues have to take a back seat to the recovery efforts, or do you see a way forward that will really address the climate crisis at the same time as we build the economy? We're so looking forward to your remarks.
Thank you, Reverend Spalding. I'm pleased to be with you in series today, and of course also with Torben and Pension Denmark, which is investing Danish workers' capital in good jobs and clean energy in Denmark, here in the United States, and around the world. More about that in a moment. And thank you to all of those who are joining online today. This is certainly different than what I expected when I agreed back in January to join Ceres once again for the Global Investor Summit. So before I turn to climate, I do want to say a word or two about what we can learn from the coronavirus crisis. You see, our response to the coronavirus has already reshaped our society. It's easy to think that the virus is the cause of those changes, but that would be a mistake. The virus simply does what it does. Human beings are the ones making the decisions that shape our societies and our lives. And it's human beings and human institutions who will either lead us through this crisis to a better day or find the virus the excuse to unleash our own fear, our own greed, our own capacity for hatred. Consider what this has meant for workers. The global labor movement has been engaged in an unceasing struggle since the virus first appeared to see that working people have the equipment, the safety protocols, and most of all, the power, dignity, and voice that we need to keep workplaces safe for everyone. Yet, despite our efforts, too many workers in critical sectors still don't have adequate protective equipment, access to testing, or paid sick days, risking exposure for themselves and their families every time they go to work. Or they can risk their family's economic security by staying home to avoid exposure. Now, this is totally unacceptable, and it has to stop. In the context of the corona crisis, that starts with the common sense measures needed to hold our economy together that are in the HEROES Act, passed by the US House last week, including the critical mandatory workplace safety standard for infectious disease. For working people, the injustices of the corona crisis are nothing new. In the United States, the lived experience of workers for the past 40 years is that most big changes in the economy result in harm to workers and our communities. Trade agreements that protect investors' rights, but not workers' rights. Outsourcing, deregulation, wages that lacked productivity for decades, while inequality soared and the cost of healthcare and education skyrocketed. Climate change and our response to it can either accelerate this trajectory or take us in a newer, better direction. Rising temperatures threaten the material foundations of our civilization, but they also pose enormous challenges to an economy formed on our sourcing and consumption of fossil fuels. Now, we think of coal miners and refinery workers, but real carbon job footprint includes railroads, trucks, and barges that haul oil and coal, the manufacturing supply chain that produce everything from delicate valves to huge mining machines that extract fossil fuel, the auto workers that make internal combustion drivetrains. See, we're talking about millions of largely good paying jobs with benefits and a secure retirement, and they're distributed throughout the United States. And these jobs didn't get to be life-sustaining careers by accident or by the laws of economics. You see, I come from a coal mining family. And when my immigrant parents went into the mines in 1920s, a coal miner's shovel was a ticket to hunger, disease, and early death. When I went into the mines in the 1960s, we had strong unions with powerful safety committees, wages that paid for houses and college education, including mine, as well as pensions and health care. But my family's health and economic security was paid for in blood, our blood, at the hands of the Pennsylvania Coal and Iron Police and the mine owners and their dangerous mines and black lung disease. And they, like so many employers today in the coronavirus, saw our health as a cost that they couldn't afford. And the same is true for oil workers and railroad workers and auto workers and utility workers. Working people made bad jobs in the carbon economy into good jobs. We fought for every dollar, for every health benefit, for every safety device and rule. And we powered this nation in the process. See, if we treat the challenge of moving to a low carbon energy sector as though it is a matter for experts and not workers, if we act as if minimum wage jobs or staffing agency jobs is the same as a job that pays middle class wages with benefits, if our response looks like the past 40 years, with the job quality declining in the energy sector as it has in so many other sectors, then of course we can expect, indeed, will create intense opposition to action on climate change. To prevent that, we must create a politics of hope. Now remember, NAFTA went into effect in 1994. Resistance to it reverberates in our politics till this very day. Without hope, our politics are in stalemate, and we cannot make progress fast enough. Not on COVID-19, not on fixing our economy, not on reversing inequality, not on fighting racism, and not on climate change. We need to understand that the true enemies of effective action on climate change are not the workers in the carbon sector, but those who would force those workers to bear the economic costs of change. Those who offer in exchange for good jobs with real benefits, poorly paid jobs with few benefits and no future. Those who would seek to combine 21st century technologies with 19th century labor practices. Those like Elon Musk, who think that because they make electric cars for rich people, they can violate social distancing orders and endanger not just their workers, but the entire community in which they do business. But we know it can be different if we make the right choices. That's why the AFL-CIO recently entered into the Labor Energy Partnership with former Secretary of Energy, Ernest Muniz. Uh, we'll work with Secretary Muniz to develop policies that advance our climate goals and create good jobs, to create hope that the fight against climate can be a win for workers. This work to lay a politically and economically viable foundation for the foundation to a clean economy must go on, even as we fight the coronavirus. You see, we have no time to waste. So we need the help of the global investor community to succeed. We want a real spirit of partnership between government, investors, workers, and operating businesses. The kind of partnership that our hosts at Series have always championed. And we can work together for a policy framework that supports clean energy and high quality jobs where workers have the ability to collectively bargain. Now, let me give you an example. Last year, I joined Senator Jeff Merkley of Oregon at the Capitol to help him introduce the Good Jobs for 21st Century Energy Act, which ties an investment tax credit to renewable energy to labor standards. The legislation has wide support. Several energy unions, the National Wildlife Foundation, the Blue Green Alliance, Data for Progress. Now, that's the kind of broad coalition that we can make real headway on these issues. The idea deserves investor support. So we must make clear by example that everyone will benefit from fighting climate change. Because the lesson in what has happened globally since the Paris Agreement was signed is that there will be a just transition to a low carbon economy, or there won't be a transition at all. And of course, a just transition must be global, just as the atmosphere itself is global. And that can only happen if we rebuild our multilateral institutions, starting with the Paris Accord itself. Now, the AFL-CIO supported the Paris Agreement, and we believe the US must stay in it. But there's no way to have a real global solution to climate until the principles of just transition are not just words in a climate treaty, but reality across the multilateral system. In the United States, the labor movement believes the offshore wind sector can be an example of how to create well-paid, community-sustaining jobs. We're putting that belief to the test on the East Coast right now. We're hopeful that offshore wind projects from Maine to North Carolina will create hundreds of thousands of good jobs from the manufacturing, supply chain, to maritime and construction jobs to operations. And the labor movement is ready not just to negotiate the terms of those jobs, but to train the skilled workers that the project sponsors will need. The labor movement trains more workers than any institution in the United States other than the US military. Our training and apprenticeship programs already train workers in the specialized skills needed for offshore wind. And we can meet the need of this vast and critically important project. Now, I personally believe that East Coast offshore wind can be a turning point of the fight against climate change in the US, not because of the huge amount of carbon neutral electric power it will generate, and it will be huge, but because of the potential for a new and truly viable workplace model that I believe we can create together. A model that can be the stable political and economic foundation of the great transformation that we must make to a low carbon economy. You see, we're encouraged by the pledges to this vision that renewable energy project developers have made in consultation with our partners at the International Trade Union Confederation, the B Team, Series, and others. This pledge has been signed by leading offshore developers and includes the following commitments: in our operations and in procurement from contractors, social dialogue with workers and their unions, fundamental rights, including the ILO core labor standards and ILO occupational health and safety standards, social protection, including pension and health care, and wage guarantees, including prevailing wage rates for skilled workers in the relevant industries. Now, last year, I asked AFL-CIO Secretary Treasurer Liz Schuler, who comes out of the power sector herself, to coordinate our work in this area and to work with our building trades and manufacturing unions to build the relationship that we need to make this vision more than words on paper. And with the help of the Danish and Norwegian labor movements, and in particular support of the Danish government, we believe we're making real progress. And one of our partners in this work is Pension Denmark. So I'm eager to hear our friend Torben's reflections on this critical work. And let me conclude with this. My friends, we can see now that the forces of authoritarianism are in a dance of death with science deniers. But it isn't just the economy or our ecology that is in peril of further damage. It's our democracy. The same people that want to deny climate science are seizing on the coronavirus crisis as another opportunity to sow division and hatred, and to undermine the public's faith in science and in the institutions of democratic government. To fight both the coronavirus and climate change, we need to address the deficit that threatens global society. And by that, I mean not the deficit. I mean the deficit of social solidarity that neoliberalism has fed for decades. In the coronavirus crisis, millions of people have sacrificed their jobs, their incomes, and their health to save the lives of people they will never meet. Working people's sense of social solidarity is undiminished. To fight climate change, the critical actors, the investor community, the leaders of multilateral institutions, tech entrepreneurs, must show the kind of solidarity that grocery workers and nurses have shown in these past terrible weeks. And I believe that if everyday workers can show such solidarity and such tremendous courage, then so can all of us. Thank you.
Thank you so much, President Trumka. Really inspiring. I want to remind our viewers and listeners, if you have questions, feel free to put them in the chat box and we'll respond after we hear from Mr. Pedersen. Having heard President Trumka's remarks, I invite you to reflect on your investment experience and your partnership. I'm assuming that you agree that these projects, particularly the ones that President Trumka spoke about on the East Coast, can be part of a recovery plan that creates good jobs and builds for the low carbon future. I turn to you now, Mr. Pedersen, to share some of your experience.
Thank you, Kirsten, and thank you, Mr. President, for a very inspiring introduction. I actually fully agree with your observations and your recommendations. Pension Denmark is a Danish-based so-called labor market pension fund. We were back in the early 90s established by the Danish unions and employers organizations. It's a two-partite structure, but unions actually have the majority of the seats in our board, and we are very closely, let's say, affiliated with the unions. So as you maybe know that in Denmark, the level of unionization is quite high. More than 90% of all the workers are actually members of their union, and many issues actually are negotiated in the labor market agreements between unions and employers organizations, including pensions. So the fact that we now can provide approximately 750,000 blue-collar workers with attractive pensions is a result of a long effort by Danish trade union movement, which have succeeded in embedding the pension rights in the collective agreements on the labor market. And the chair of our board is also the president of the largest union in Denmark, Mr. Per Christensen, head of what previously we called the General Workers Union. And so we have almost, let's say, daily close relationship and dialogue with the unions. So in all our activities as an investor, we have a very strong focus on how we can combine our, let's say, goal to get access to attractive returns on the savings of our members with acting on the responsibility as a responsible investor with a very high focus on the social dimensions in the investment process. So the idea of the just transition concept and program is fully supported by us. We are a relatively large investor in renewable energy infrastructure, but also in real estate, where we are involved in the early stage as a developer and taking care of the construction. So we have also a very strong responsibility as an, let's say, indirect employer in the construction sites, whether it's offshore wind farms or real estate projects in Europe. And in all cases, we have a long list of, demands where we have a strong focus on health and security, health and safety issues, on respect the union presence at the workplaces, and making sure that all workers involved in our projects, whether it's infrastructure or real estate, are covered by collective agreements, if that's the case. So, but to give you a few information about what we're doing in the renewable energy area. Actually, we were one of the first pension funds to find a way to be a direct investor into, let's say, physical renewable energy infrastructure assets when we acquired a 50% stake in a Danish offshore wind farm 10 years ago. Since then, we have moved on, and now we are owner or co-owner of more than 25 renewable energy infrastructure projects all over the world, primarily in Western Europe and in the US. Recently, we have also moved into areas like Taiwan, Japan, Australia, and has a few months ago established what we call a new market fund, trying to, let's say, duplicate our experiences from Europe and US in countries in the developing world. But now we have actually we are the owner of let's say, green power production capacity equivalent to the yearly electric power consumption of approximately 1 million Danish households. And we expect this figure to double over the next 5 years. And this means actually that we have a very nice storyline in the communication with our members. We tell the members of Pension Denmark that, well, we are not only providing you with good pensions when you retire, so you can keep up a good living standard, but we also provide you with green power. So when you turn on the light in your house, it's green power from your own wind farm that lightens up the place. That has been a very compelling story, and has actually really increased the support from our members and our stakeholders to our commitment to be an active investor in the green climate, in the climate agenda, and the climate transition. In the US, back in 2012, we, in order to increase our capacity and get access to specialized skills, we established a dedicated investment vehicle called Copenhagen Infrastructure Partners. In the beginning, we were the only investor in this vehicle, but now we have, let's say, expanded the club, so we have now more than 50 like-minded investors on board, including a few American ones, most of them located in the New York City area, and has become actually the world's largest investor in green infrastructure. So in a few weeks' time, we will announce the next fund run by Copenhagen Infrastructure Partners with approximately close to $8 billion on the commitment, and a very strong investor base, including our American friends. So in the US, we are engaged in a number of projects in the offshore area in the east, from Massachusetts down to New York. We have strong positions in the onshore wind farm area in the Midwest area, and involved in a number of solar projects both in Texas, but also in a number of southern states. We have a more, let's say, project in the development phase in California to develop floating offshore wind farms, which is necessary in California because of the high water depth in the ocean over there. So we think that as in the present situation where the world has to find a way to recover from the serious economic impact of the pandemic and on the coronavirus, we really stress and support the concept of combining the restart of the economies with let's say a strong focus on expanding investments in the green transition. And I can inform you that actually today, a few hours ago, the Danish government announced a very ambitious program called a green restart of Denmark, where we have, let's say, the health dimensions of the corona stuff under control. We're now moving into the restart phase, and the government has outlined a number of initiatives and where most of them will need finance from the private sector, and especially from the pension fund industry. And the Danish pension funds have committed ourselves to provide a really large part of our portfolios into these programs. And I think that could be inspirational also for other countries, that a strong cooperation between the government and the pension funds could mobilize private capital at a large scale to make the necessary economic stimulus to the economies supporting the green transition, so that we at the same time can both create jobs and support the green transition. And we certainly think that we have a responsibility to play an active part in that. The President mentioned the Just Transition Pledge, and I will assure that we are very in line with the ambitions and the concept of the pledge. And I personally feel a responsibility to expand the numbers of companies, institutions supporting the pledge, as I, a few months ago, had the honor to become a member of the B team leaders. So I think that that's a part of my new obligations. As I said in the start, we have a very strong relationship to the Danish trade union movement, and they are very focused that we also, as it behave in a union, in a way that can be accepted by unions, also when we are investing outside of Denmark, investing abroad, including US. In our offshore projects in Massachusetts, the so-called Vineyard project, we have already reached very good agreements with the unions there, and all the principles outlined by Mr. President in your introduction is fully fulfilled and aligned in these contracts and negotiations. What we need now is to find out how we can implement the principles of the pledge in what we're doing in our onshore and our solar activities on land, so to say. But I think that the offshore industry would be a spearhead when it comes to combining investments in green transition with raising the labor standards and making it clear that you can combine the climate agenda with a social just transition agenda. And you should not be, you should really be sure that we will be very active in ensuring that where we are involved as an investor should be at the highest standard, both when it comes to health and safety. What we have in the Massachusetts project implemented the standard from the Danish offshore industry, which are very strict and we have actually used the close relationship between the Danish Union of Electricians, their relationship with the US Union of Electricians, to get access to all relevant unions in the Massachusetts area. So I think that you will, Mr. President, you will find the structure there very satisfying. But I will promise you that we have actually already asked our partners in the Copenhagen Infrastructure Partners to look into how we could, whether we could also make the step to make an official commitment to the pledge, like some of our colleagues and competitors in the industry already has done, including our great Danish colleague Ørsted, which is also active in the Massachusetts area. So I think that besides what we can do, I think you also in US should let's say be aware of the importance of that we in the public tenders emphasize high standards. So we as developers, constructors, investors actually can apply to high standards in the tender stuff. So, and I think that we have been very successful in Europe in the dialogue with authorities, governments, to make sure that when they make a public tender for, let's say, a new offshore wind farm, they not only are focusing on economic on price issues, but also include in the tender material that the developers and the constructors should live up to quite high standards when it comes to environment, social and labor conditions, both during the construction period, but also when it comes to the operational period of the assets. I think that's also important because as a wind farm will have a lifespan of maybe 30-35 years, and it's important that the operational maintenance activities also are done in a good way when it comes to labor conditions. For example, in Massachusetts, we have already now made an agreement with the organization who have to run the support harbor as onshore, so that we can make sure that people who are to facilitate the wind farm, making boat trips with service personnel, they also have correct labor market conditions. So, in general, I say that we think that the offshore wind farms now under construction or under planning at the East Coast in the US will be some kind of, let's say, best practice or state of the art, because you are building upon experiences from especially from the European and North Sea, Danish, German, Dutch, UK experiences. So you don't have to make the same mistakes as we have experienced in the early days. and the quality of the wind technology now is extremely high. The economic efficiency is also extremely high. So in a few years' time, you don't have to use subsidies actually, because the price of producing power from offshore wind will be competitive with fossil sources. So I think that I think that in a few years' time you will look upon the U.S. East Coast as an best practice or state-of-the-art example of how to generate green power capacity, so they at the same time can provide the large cities at the East Coast with green power, but also demonstrate that that can be done at the same time providing the workers on the sites, both constructions and operational sites, with good wages, good social protection, and the other issues the president mentioned. But so please think of Pension Denmark and our other partners as a partner in this journey. And I think that especially in these times where unemployment have exploded in US, the need for generating a new type of jobs is even more important. And I think that to have a relatively high speed on the construction of new green energy infrastructure facilities, both on and offshore wind, solar, and so on, should be also regarded as a very, say, future-looking way of creating lasting, high quality and well-paid jobs for US workers who are now facing a very tough time. Yeah.
Thank you so much, Mr. Pedersen. Yeah, bravo. A couple of really important big pieces of news here. Your commitment and your appreciation for the Just Transition Pledge is really wonderful to hear. I have not heard that before, so really thank you so much for that commitment. I'm sure it's good news for President Trump. This is really terrific. I think also what you mentioned about the Green Start program that's being implemented in Denmark, this is really a model for the kind of partnerships that we're looking for between government policymakers, investors, and workers who are most affected as we try and rebuild our economy all over the world going forward. We have a number of questions coming in, and so first, I want to take the investor perspective, because I know many in our audience today are investors. And I'm wondering in particular about how they can participate. We got a question for you, President Trumpka, but I'd welcome either one of your responses. How can they participate in supporting things like the Labor Energy Partnership that you've started, President Trumpka, or working with other investors, as you suggested, Mr. Pedersen, to really build these infrastructure projects? What's the role of other investors going forward, both on the policy side and on the investment side?
I think they should look at investments that are inclusive, just like you heard on the wind project. One that are going to say, let's do something to help the environment, but let's do something that helps workers at the same time, so that they don't bear the entire cost of that. Speaking about that in the marketplace, talking to people that offer investment vehicles about those things is important. It's the chatter that they create, because their talking can create a demand for products that are green and win for workers as well. That's what we're looking for. If we do that, then I think everything wins, and the transition towards a green economy actually becomes easier, and workers aren't asked to pay the price in that process.
Yes, but if I might add, as to address the investors in the audience, because I didn't say much about that in my first introduction, but in these low interest rate environments, probably interest rate will stay low for a very long period of time, both in Europe and in the US. We have an obligation, a fiduciary obligation, to identify other investments which can generate attractive returns to our members, and especially returns that are not assets that are not closely correlated with the stock markets and with a lower volatility. And I think that many investments in renewable energy infrastructure actually provides you as an investor with access to attractive returns and stable returns because of the structure in you typically have a power purchasing agreement with a utility or a company or an authority, meaning that the cash flow in the project are very stable and foreseeable, and you can make a number of risk mitigation structures where you actually make a structure where the provider of the turbines have the responsibility for the maintenance of the turbines, and so you can, as an investor, actually mitigate risk in a very effective way and end up with a very attractive risk-adjusted return. We have, during the last decade, in average, generated non-geared returns on our infrastructure portfolio at approximately 10% per year, and I think that compared with even with the stock market, that's quite attractive. And of course, if you only have capacity to invest in brownfield existing assets, you will have to accept the lower returns. But if you team up like we have done with experienced developers and also people with experience in monitoring the construction of new facilities, you can get access to the development premium, which actually get you into the area of, let's say, between 8 and 12% in returns. So from a purely return perspective, I think that investments in renewable energy infrastructures now are one of the most attractive opportunities in the present market. I think you should be aware that US is a very large market, and there are a number of projects in the pipeline, so to say. But if you look at the rest of the world, especially Asia, you have extremely ambitious plans for the growth in the offshore sector. And I think that we think that in the future, maybe something where between a third and 50% of our new investments in offshore will be in Asia. India, Vietnam, Indonesia, the Philippines are on our board. Yes.
This is really music to the ears of investors. The idea that the risks can be shared by coming into a pooled fund like CIP, really putting the risks where they belong in these complex projects, but really seeing those opportunities for good returns, both what our pensions need to recover, but also the kinds of good jobs that President Trumka spoke about. President Trumka, we just got a question about what you're hearing on Capitol Hill. You're there in Washington. I know that you're involved in the recovery conversations. What are you hearing today about the possibility for bills and budget expenditures that would really match your vision for where we need to go as the economy rebuilds?
Well, workers have been talking about the importance of providing health and safety protections and a contagious disease standard for those workers, and then taking care of workers who are laid off, who are about to lose their health care. Fortunately, our voices were heard. The House of Representatives just passed a bill. It's called the HEROES Act, that one mandates a health and safety standard for every employer out there within 7 days. 2, it will increase the benefits, unemployment benefits plus $600 a week through January 31st. It will provide 100% of benefits for healthcare for COBRA payments for 9 full months. It will continue to help states and local governments. We've seen state and local governments start to lay off. Almost 900,000 local governments have laid off, and about 200,000 state governments, to prevent that from continuing, and thus doing 2 things: adding to the unemployment number, but contracting the level of services that are out there. There's about $1 trillion in that bill that would offer to state and local governments to keep schools going, to keep hospitals going, and then $25 billion for our postal service that's under tremendous stress because of all of this. It would keep the postal service going. So all of that is good. We haven't heard such a receptive voice from the Republican side of the aisle. Oh, there's one other thing that I must mention, or Torbert would be very angry with me if I didn't. In the first CARES bill, the 35 million people who get their pensions in this country from multi-employer plans and single employer plans were left out of that bill completely. Now, there was a crisis, a pension crisis in this country before the pandemic. The pandemic has actually worsened that crisis for those pension plans. So there is $100 billion, 10 billion a year over 10 years to help those pension plans to get them through this pandemic. And it changes the rules to allow pensions to smooth out or take the losses that we receive this year over a longer period of time, so it doesn't have the dramatic effect on the pension plans that it would have otherwise had. That is in there. Unfortunately, the last time it was in there as well, but one person and one person alone stopped that from happening. That was Mitch McConnell. Everybody supported that bill, including the president the last time, and Mitch McConnell stopped it from happening. Why? I have no idea. I would say this in summary, both the CARES bill and the HERO bill are not stimulus bills. They're bills that get us through this period of time to maintain payroll, to do a number of things. Although the HERO Act does have about $15 billion in it for infrastructure and 15 billion plus for transit, to help transit. But it is not what I would call a stimulus package. That's going to have to come later. So we told them to go bold and large. Both bills combined are about $5 trillion, $2 trillion the first one, $3 trillion the second one. They're aimed in the right direction. We need now to get some pressure on the Senate to pass the HEROES Act so that then we can get on to reopening the economy and starting back to a path of recovery.
Mm-hmm. That's exactly right. You know, I am hearing the same, that what we're seeing immediately is not about stimulus. It's not about the long-term work that we have to do, both as investors and as policymakers, to really grow the economy and come back stronger for working people and for all of our communities. I wanted to just note that the investor agenda, which is the framework created by the investor networks around the world, has just come out with a global statement on sustainable recovery. And many of the themes that the two of you talked about are in that statement. So Ceres is a founding partner of the investor agenda, and we signed that. Our hope is that now, as we begin to move into these stimulus negotiations that you talked about, President Trumka, that investors will really stand with us in local governments, in national governments around the world, so that we'll see more programs like the Green Start program and really break through whatever the logjam is that you're mentioning here in the US and get those projects moving. I think I have time for one more question that came in from the audience. Oh, let me just say, if you wanted to see that statement, it's on theinvestoragenda.org on our website. We can send that out to participants. But the question that came in was about water infrastructure. As you talked, President Trump, about the layoffs in local government, those water utilities, the infrastructure has been neglected for years. This is not a new thing. Is there any opportunity from pension funds to see those as possible investments and a way to, again, really build on sustainability, think about the water infrastructure we need, and create or maintain the jobs that we're losing? Torben, have you thought about water infrastructure as part of your CIP portfolio?
Actually, not in the CRP structure, but together with other partners, we have actually now started the development of a project where we will use the experience and capacity of a number of Danish, let's say, water technology companies to create a structure where we can deliver what we call fully financed turnkey solutions in clean water solutions to both developed world, but also to the developing countries. So we have, like as we have done in the offshore wind, we have created a structure where we can say it's a plug and play solution. We can deliver a total solution. Yeah. We are now trying to develop a similar structure in the clean water area, which also in the waste management and a number of other areas where we are very much inspired by both the Paris Agreement and the UN SDGs. As you probably all know, most countries have national action plans on both the Paris Agreement and the SDGs. And if you look into these national action plans, it's clear for us that there are many projects out there who could be attractive for Danish consortiums. Yeah.
I apologize. I'm going to have to move to President Trumka for the last word, and then we'll wrap up. Thank you.
Just very briefly, this can be a three-way win. If you clean up something like leaks and seeps, we spend, some cities lose as much as 20% of their clean water to leaks in the pipelines. If we clean that up, it's an investment, a stimulus investment. 2, it cleans up the environment. 3, it keeps great jobs. The same with gas line leaks. Gas line leaks are putting things into the atmosphere, CO2 into the atmosphere. It's a three-way win. This is a great place to invest so that everybody actually wins. Workers, community, and the investors all win. And we are foursquare, 100% behind every one of those investments.
There's so much more to say. Thank you both. This conversation is truly inspiring. I want to, we at Ceres just want to make the commitment that we, with our companies and investors and our partnerships around the world, look forward to continuing to work with you to build better after the pandemic and work together for a just and sustainable economy. Thank you for taking part in today's session. You see on the screen our sponsors. Thank you so much to all of them who made this possible, and to our co-hosts, Ceres, the UN Foundation, the UN Office for Partnerships. We could not do this without you. And a note that we will be emailing a recording of this session to you all. And to learn about upcoming webinars as we move forward for the next month, you'll see the listing at www.ceres2020.org. Thank you so much. This session is adjourned.